My name is Soraya, and you are listening to Wild Roots. In Sweden, they call it allemansstaten. In Finland, it is known as jokamiehenoikeus. And in Great Britain, it is simply known as the right to roam. These are all terms that describe a citizen's freedom to travel, camp, picnic, or simply explore nature in open countrysides, regardless of who owns property rights to that land. This is the right to roam. In this episode, we speak with author Ken Ilgunas on the history of roaming in America, right to roam laws in other countries around the world, and how and why we might consider re-establishing these rights. So join us as we venture into the possibility of the freedom to trust and wonder. Let's start off with an introduction of who you are and what you've done.
So I'm a writer, a journalist, author, occasionally a seasonal backcountry ranger in Alaska. One of my latest passions is the right to roam, which is the freedom to wander either the public or private countryside. I've written two travel memoirs. I grew up in Wheatfield, New York, just outside of Buffalo. I've lived in a number of American states, and now I live in the United Kingdom, this little town called Dunbar in Scotland, with my wife and child of 5 months.
So I just want to thank you for writing this, because it's really something that's not in the consciousness of most Americans. And I definitely am someone who really appreciates the tremendous freedom of being able to roam and explore the backcountry and wildernesses. And to think of that being taken away not only undermines who I am and what I do, but it would also be tremendously soul-crushing for me. And yet we are facing creeping privatization of public lands. And still at this point, there are a lot of people who don't even realize public lands as belonging to each and every one of us, which are arguably our most precious commons. So basically, humans have roamed unrestricted across nearly all landscapes. But with the introduction of restrictive private land ownership, things have certainly changed. Can you talk to us about how exactly did roaming individuals, once considered simply as travelers, become known instead as trespassers in different parts of the world and in the U.S.?
It's an interesting question, because we could take that all the way back to our hunter-gatherer days when we lived in small tribes. And, I used to imagine that as kind of a roaming paradise. You got to go over wherever you wanted in the Paleolithic. But the truth is that it was probably not the case, because modern day anthropologists have studied hunter-gatherer tribes, and it's not quite like that. Sometimes there's very well defined boundaries between tribes. Sometimes they're more porous and open. But the truth is, no one really owned land back then. Like, no one person ever owned 10,000 acres. So that's the biggest difference between our hunter-gatherer ancestors and us today. Things, private property and land ownership, I would say those things began to form around 12,000 years ago with the Neolithic Revolution and farming, and where things like paternity and inheritance mattered far much more. But at the same time, peasants, looking forward to the Middle Age Europe, peasants were able to retain a lot of rights to their land in what was known as the commons. And these peasants were able to use the commons for collecting peat or wood or drawing water or letting their cattle graze or having kind of festivals there. And that was a few hundred years ago. Uh, to look at England, that began to change. We saw the closing of the commons begin around the 15th and 16th and 17th centuries, a period known as enclosure. And that's where a lot of rich people and industrial agriculturalists began to seize common land through acts of parliament and oftentimes by force. And we kind of saw the closing of the commons. And just to continue looking at Britain, it was interesting to see a walking rights movement begin to bud. It begins to blossom, however you want to put it, in the early 20th century, when you have all these people working in factories, living in cities, and they can't go to what was previously common land.
Right.
Aristocrats owned thousands and thousands of acres. To look at the what is now the Peak District in northern England, near the towns of Sheffield and Manchester, that was owned by just a few aristocrats, but there was tons of people living in these squalid cities, and they just wanted to get out and get out on the weekends for a little bit of fresh air, sunshine, and scenery. And they began to kind of stage these mass trespasses. They got together in these big groups, and they kind of symbolically walked over those lands, not to seize it. They weren't saying, we want the end of private property. We want this land for ourselves. They just wanted the right to occasionally walk it for recreation. And of course, they got in a lot of trouble for doing so. But they started a movement which brings us to today, when countries like Scotland and England and Wales have passed amazing laws that grant people amazing freedoms over their natural countrysides. And of course, it's not that way. It's not that way everywhere in the world.
Right. So tell us about the Scottish culture, because it's actually a deeply embedded tradition to consider the land common for all, and they created the Land Reform Act. They're probably the beaming example of what America could be. Could you talk about what steps we could have? I guess you did talk about what steps that we could take to kind of integrate these laws in America. Could you talk a little bit about what they've done and what we could do?
It's an interesting case, Scotland. The right to roam kind of predates the law. The law was passed in 2003. It was called the Land Reform Scotland Act. But for centuries, people had been going on the land. There's an old Gaelic saying that every Scot deserves a fish from the river, a deer from the hills, and a tree from the wood. So there's just this kind of common idea of shared ownership among places. So people have been walking out into the highlands and islands and all over the place for a long time, but it was just kind of formalized in 2003. So I mean, what we can learn about Scotland is kind of how to do it right. They passed this law, which says basically that anybody can access the countryside so long as they're doing so responsibly. And anything that's not responsible is illegal, and therefore it can be penalized. So you can't invade anybody's privacy. You can't litter. You can't walk over vulnerable crops. You can't take motorized access, and a whole bunch of other small rules and regulations. But outside of those, you have these amazing freedoms to say, swim in a pond, or paddle a canoe down a river, or bird watch, or go out to the hills and paint a mountain, or hike and camp and pick berries. And when you go out there and experience it, it's, you get this feeling like this is how it should be. Like
Uh-huh.
why isn't it like this anywhere? It's just an amazingly liberating sensation, and you feel like a free human. And sometimes
Yeah.
we just kind of don't get that opportunity often
Yeah,
enough.
yeah. When I think about this, I think in terms of the human animal's need for that experience. And to not be allowed to roam this earth as humans is extremely restrictive. And, considering that we did so for hundreds of thousands of years. And in the book, you said, quote, "We may not realize it, but there is deep in the American subconscious a love for roaming. To be able to roam is the mark of a free and adventurous life, an act of nonconformity, of independence, of self-reliance," and so on. And you say Americans, but you're really meaning humans. And human nature is curious, and naturally we would be curious to explore our surrounding landscape. But what we have now is a very unnatural stowed away life. We stow away not only our stuff but ourselves as well. So it's a pretty strange reality we're living.
It's very inadequate, and I'm kind of hunkering down in rural North Carolina in this little county called Stokes, and I used to live here a few years ago, and I came back to kind of sit out this pandemic, and I can't tell you how many trees I saw painted in purple paint, which is an indicator of where you're not supposed to go. You're no trespassing. There's no trespassing and no private signs all over the
Mm-hmm.
place. And now some of our state parks are being shut down because of overuse. You got folks from Winston-Salem and Greensboro coming up, and there's just too many people. So it's just like, where are you supposed to go?
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I don't want to complain too much because I'm able to find plenty of spaces to wander, but I'm just kind of thinking about the rest of the population facing similar predicaments. And I think if something like a right to roam was put in place, we'd be able to live this thing out far more pleasurably.
Yes, I was going to ask you that later on. Of course, this pandemic changes things right now, and we understand the reasoning behind some of the closures. But I am fortunate enough to be living near lots of public land, which brings me, which is a great release for me. I think if that was taken from me right now, I'd probably lose my mind. But at this point in time, it seems we need those open spaces more than ever. So, yeah, maybe you can elaborate on how you think having that available would benefit us more at this time.
It would just benefit us in so many ways, starting with the obvious. We'd be in better physical health if we had easily accessible nature. And there's studies that back that up. In
Right.
Japan, there's this thing called a forest bath, Shinrin Yoku,
Shinrin
and
Yoku.
yeah, and scientists took some Japanese businessmen. A forest bath is basically a walk through the forest. I don't know why they call
Mm-hmm.
it a bath. And then they kind of had other people walk through the city, and they examined their bodies. They took tests, and they found that the stress hormone cortisol significantly decreased in people who were taking walks in nature. There's evidence of folks having better mental health from having walked in nature. There's just the everyday dose of freedom that we sometimes forget we have. There's a sense of connecting with our local environments more. It's not going
Yeah.
to be terribly far in the future where we start kind of car shaming and plane shaming people for the amount of fossil fuels we use. So I think looking into the future, something like the right to roam that permits us to get out into our local countrysides, it's going to help us establish a relationship with the natural environments. It's going to allow us to love these places. And if we love these places, we're going to protect these places. And also, I would say that maybe most importantly, it's going to make us feel more equal. And I think that's something we don't feel as Americans. I mean, there's so much evidence of wealth inequality, but there's also great land ownership inequality. For instance, the top 100 landowners in America, they own 40 million acres. That's the size of 18 Yellowstone national parks. And I think this sense of inequality that we kind of all, to some sense, feel, it makes us less trusting as a people. So if we can look at land, if we can look at that beachfront property or the 10,000 acres of, Wyoming estate land and say, hey, you know what, that's someone else's land, but hey, that's also sort of my land at the same time. I think that would go so far to make us feel a more equal people and that we'd be living in a more just society.
Yeah, I really like the way that you ended the book about that fact that we are connected not only to our own land, if our own place, but our neighbor's place and the care of that place or destruction of that place. It all affects each and every one of us. So it's important to see it as a one single commons. It doesn't make any sense how far we've gone away from that. It does seem like there is a limit to what we could do to reestablish that right, because it does seem that we'll never have the same roaming rights that we naturally once did. So maybe you can speak about to what reasons and limitations we now face.
Yeah, and I'm not quite prepared to say that we're going to never retrieve our old rights. When you think about the rights, the roaming rights we once enjoyed, it wasn't that long ago that Americans had the right to roam. And when I say Americans, I am talking about Euro Americans and white Americans. But from about the founding of this country up until the Civil War, the 1860s, Euro Americans had amazing roaming rights. This wasn't just reflected in laws, but also court cases. And Euro Americans essentially had the right to roam unenclosed land, which means no fences, and hardly any of early America was fenced because there was no barbed wire and fencing was very costly, and unimproved land, which means no farms. So people were hunting and fishing and traveling over private property all the time. And this was serious. Like the Pennsylvania delegation to the Constitutional Convention even proposed a right to roam amendment for the Bill of Rights. That's how important accessing nature was. So this culture of exclusion that we now have is only 150 or so years old. So I imagine installing something that other European countries are enjoying, such as we talked about, Scotland or the Nordic countries, Sweden, Finland, and Norway, or the Baltic countries of Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia. And they have very generous systems. It's highly regulated. There's educational campaigns to teach kids and even adults how to experience and take care of nature and to take access responsibly.
Yeah. That was going to be my next statement, was, basically the arguments against roaming don't seem all unreasonable and can easily be sympathized with, as you said in the book, such as a comment from someone on one of your articles about Americans being destructive, irresponsible litterbugs. And this is what really lends itself to that idyllic notion of right of responsible access. And I know far too well that it often takes just one act of irresponsible behavior and then it's ruined for all. Every long distance traveler that I've ever met, for instance, sees litter on a trail or wherever as a disgrace, and they usually opt to pick it up and pack it out themselves. I mean, I've done this countless times. And you address this too in the book. So what are your ideas on this? How can these sorts of destructive behaviors be curbed, which you were basically getting into?
Yes, and I should say that I'm kind of experiencing this all the time. I live in a flat in Scotland, and I share this flat building with 3 other people, and one of them is a terrible, terrible litter bug, and she just leaves piles and piles of trash. So it's just, I'm sympathetic to that argument, and litter bothers me as much as anyone. But to kind of say that Americans are nothing but, you know, destructive, irresponsible litter bugs, though there is certainly some truth to that, I think it's wrong to kind of classify us as an irredeemable people.
Mm-hmm.
Um, because when you look at other cultures that better manage their nature and teach people how to move through nature in a more responsible way, you see how they got it done. You see that there was a method to it, and a method that could be emulated. I remember speaking with this human geographer in Scotland, and she studied the right to roam, and she'd been to Norway to see how their right to roam was managed, and she remembers going to this town called Trondheim, and all these teenagers, these 17 and 18-year-olds, like 50 of them, were having this massive bonfire up on top of the hill. And, they were drinking, who knows, smoking, who knows what they were doing. And she said, this is going to be an absolute mess tomorrow. And and the next day she walked up this hill, and guess what she saw? It was completely spotless.
Oh.
All of these teenagers cleaned up their mess. And that's because a lot of these Nordic countries, they're teaching their kids at a very young age how to live in nature and not to litter, and how to protect sensitive environments. And that even works in America. Like when you look at some of the anti-littering campaigns, one of the most popular is "Don't Mess with Texas,"
Yes.
and they tried to reduce roadside litter, so they got a whole bunch of celebrities like Lance Armstrong and Leanne Rimes, and they showed these like anti-littering task force superheroes to kids in school. And in just a few years, roadside litter was dramatically reduced. So I reject the idea that we're irredeemable people. And yes, it may take years, it may take a full generation, but I think we can change.
We are so redeemable. When you said when you said she found that area cleaned up, it gave me goosebumps. That's really beautiful, and not something that I'm used to seeing or experiencing. It's not something that I normally expect. I do think it's possible to create a cognizant shift in American consciousness, but
I think part of it's also not getting too upset and too offended. Like here in North Carolina, I used to live here for about 7 years with my friend, and he has 5 acres of land and a creek and a trail that goes through it. And every once in a while, we see some plastic or a crinkled beer can, and instead of getting all upset and
just pick it up, pack it out.
Just pick it up and forget about it, and just and some people would kind of want to close down that trail just because of a little bit of litter here and there. But that's an amazing right and freedom and pleasure for people, and just sometimes the positives outweigh those small negatives.
And I even think that the more that people are out there and use it, the more likely the more sensitive they'll be to litter and picking it up, and then it will eventually curb the whole behavior altogether.
And I talk about that in my book. I interviewed an estate manager in Scotland. They have these big estates owned by rich people, and they have these land managers, and this land manager administered over, I don't know, like 500, 1,000 acres. And he was having a lot of problem with these arsonists. These kids would come and get drunk or do drugs and light these fires. So he had this thing called a Bowser, and he would fill up this Bowser with water, and he was using it like every week to put out fires. And this was actually before 2003, when Scotland made the right to roam law. So he just had this crazy idea. He says, instead of continually trying to close this estate down, what if we do something crazy and radical? What if we open it up to the greater public? And as soon as he did that, all of these, I hate to use the word like normal and responsible people, they started walking this estate, and all of a sudden these teenagers felt uncomfortable to to do their drugs and light their fires and all of that. And he says now he doesn't even know where that Bowser is. It's covered in grass and cobwebs right now.
So I mean, the responsible ones, which I think would end up being the majority, would sort of lead the path to formalize that better behavior.
And I think part of the problem is, I walked from Alberta, Canada, down to the Gulf Coast of Texas through some of the most remote parts of the country, eastern Montana and South Dakota. And I think when there is no kind of culture of walking and travelers and hikers and kind of non-hunting recreationists, it's kind of easy to be afraid and paranoid about that which you don't know. And I completely sympathize with that. I used to be a backcountry ranger in the gates of the Arctic National Park, where I'd go on an 8-day patrol, and I'd say maybe 2 people over the course of those 8 days. And I remember if I hadn't seen anyone for like 4 days in a row, and then suddenly I saw 2 people rowing a canoe, it's just like, what the hell is that? They look like aliens to me. And my first response was fear. But I think once there is kind of a culture of hiking and access taking and all of that, you realize it's not as scary as you once did. So, I mean, you see this all over Scotland. If you see some bearded guy or some in-shape woman with backpacks, it's not like, what the hell is that? It's just like, just more backpackers.
Yeah, so a few years ago on the Chinle Divide, I was in northern New Mexico at the time. And the Chinle Divide is a very unique system of routes. And who I was hiking with at the time and I had been studying the map and had decided to just forge our own route off of the main trail system, cross country. After so many miles, we came upon this hill, and just as we crested the hill, we saw a lone cabin near a creek and 2 men fishing on the creek. And we just stopped and were totally stunned, not having seen other people in maybe a few days or so. And what was running through our minds was, oh crap, are we walking through private property right now? And, giving it the benefit of the doubt, we walked down and talked with them, and it was all fine. It was not this scary encounter like what modern culture makes it out to be. It turned out to be a very pleasant meeting, and that has happened multiple times since then. I've developed a lot of trust for people when traveling. I've hitchhiked at least over 70 rides or so. I don't remember how many, but and I've been invited into people's cabins and homes and stayed with warm people and amazing hospitality. And traveling afoot seems for the most part pretty benign to me, but there's still an air of mistrust of people and from people that permeates our modern culture. And I think people like these stories are good to share because it kind of dispels that.
The right to roam, I don't see it as just a way to get out into nature more. I see it as a way to foster our sense of trust with one another more. Because I've had those same experiences with you. I counted up all the miles. I've hitchhiked 10,000 miles across North America. And, when I would start one of those like hitchhiking trips, you'd start so very fearful. You're like, what do these people want? Are they going to steal stuff off from me or do anything to me? And after a while, you just begin to sense that America actually isn't so bad, and people are generally very good, and the adventure of it is not just being a solo person on a journey. Perhaps the most adventurous thing you can feel is trust in other people, because you can move through the world in this much more liberating way when you're not constantly second guessing people or worried about people, but you can just move through the world in a more relaxing way. So I view the right to roam as a more trustful society rather than all those mistrusting signs and fences and
Yeah,
barbed
and
wires.
that's the ultimate beauty in it. And on that same, route, later on, I was hiking through Idaho, and we came across, ridiculous signs with guns pointing at you saying, if you would like to meet Jesus sooner, trespass on my property. Just utter ridiculousness. And I think people distrust each other because of these sort of misleading signs, that just dissuade people from trusting people, and walls and fencing don't help this. But and people tend to assume people are always massively armed, which you talked about. But even though they may be gun owners, they're not necessarily dangerous. When you have a human and human interaction, it deflates a lot of what you might have thought of the other person.
Yes, and I used to think that the American landowner is kind of like the caricature of like a fire-breathed,
Yeah.
gun-toting Yosemite Sam, But having walked across the Great Plains, and granted, I probably had it easier than some folks would because I'm just, a white dude going through very homogenous Caucasian country. But I learned that, they were all very generous and kind, and only one person brought out his gun when he saw me, and he promptly put it away once we started talking.
Oh, really?
Um, so yeah, but I do think there's kind of two kind of warring mentalities in America, and one believes the world should be built around the need to provide for individual pursuits and individual liberty, which sounds great, and sometimes they are great. But then the other is a view for the common good.
Yes.
And we've seen America switch back and forth between the two. I'd say up until 1980, when Ronald Reagan took over. From about the 1930s to 1980, we were more of a common good sort of country, and then we became more of a individual liberty sort of country. And it remains to be seen what we're going to become. When you look at some of the Democratic nominees, whether it's Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren, who look with great suspicion on a lot of the economic policies that celebrate individual pursuits and liberty, and who are calling for measures that are for the common good, you begin to wonder if America is kind of shifting back in that direction. And I am hopeful of it, but I'm at the same time not sure.
Well, talking to you makes me feel hopeful. So just the fact that this book has been written, so thank you.
It's my pleasure, yeah.
I just want to briefly interject here for my listeners that you will be hearing a siren in the background, and it will get a little bit loud at one point. But just because of the nature of where the interview was conducted, this was unavoidable, and it was something that I could not edit out. So please bear with it, and it will pass. Thank you. My listeners might already know now that I don't hide the fact that I despise public land grazing, and I personally think it's insane that we allow invasive cattle to roam public lands. Really, the only lands where people are essentially free to roam broadly in the United States. And we often don't get to roam pristine countrysides in many parts of the country, especially the West. They're usually overrun, or often, not all of them, but there's a lot of land out there that's overrun by public land grazing cattle, extremely overgrazed or damaged, or simply mismanaged to the degree in which its wild character is sort of lost. And this seems incomparable to the damage that human roamers would likely inflict upon the land. I would like to know what your thoughts are on this.
I wish I'd talked to you before about that, because that's a very interesting argument to make, and that could have supported some of my arguments. But some of the research I did was just how accessible and roamable are our public lands. In many cases, national parks or state parks, you're really stuck to trails and a few designated campgrounds here and there. A lot of them are closed up for good reasons, for conservation and to channel people and kind of one responsible route. Or when you look at some of our fish and wildlife refuges, a lot of those are inaccessible or off limits. When you look at Bureau of Land Management land, I forget the exact number, but roughly 10% of that, or 23 million acres, are inaccessible because private owners have blockaded access to it. So when you look on paper, that roughly a third of America is public. So national parkland isn't that roamable. Fish and wildlife land, not exactly. So much of our national forest land and Bureau of Land Management land is inaccessible. And for an East Coaster like myself, I kind of look at all that public land out west, and it's like I don't even have any access to that. About 40% of the public land in all of America is in Alaska, and that's great for someone like me who used to be a park ranger up there. But to everybody else, that's inaccessible. It's kind of irrelevant in some ways. So our public lands, as wonderful as they don't come close to meeting our human needs for nature access and roaming.
No, they don't. And then you have issues with illegal signage sometimes in national forests and other places. There are a lot of signs out west, and some of them you really question. And also there's completely landlocked public lands. One of the most notable examples would be in Montana. So how does one even gain access to that?
I guess you could be parachuted in.
I've thought about that.
That's what
I've seriously thought about it.
I actually thought about that. I thought about that just as a stunt, just to show kind of how crazy.
I thought about that too.
It's become bright minds think alike.
Yeah.
I don't know what to say about it other than that it's just a travesty and a tragedy.
Yeah, it is. It is pretty sad. And I want people to know that that's happening, though. And, to make that... It's still hard to kind of get people's minds wrapped around the fact that we own this public land. It's just not in our culture. And plus, a lot of times there's a divide between the East and the West, which you were kind of talking about, right? The West knows of its grandiose land, and in the East we're used to these paths and things like that, and small parcels.
And this goes back to our two warring mentalities, where some private landowners think they have the right to close off what is the land of 330 million Americans, so they could have exclusive access to it and sell the rights to hunt it. So they're basically overtaking our wildlife too.
Yeah, they are. So some of the most celebrated writers write about their countryside wanderings, and now we tend to mostly roam countrysides, restricted, as you say, to paths or on public lands only, unless willing to be charged with trespassing. But as long as walkers aren't making unreasonable interferences with the land or other people, these laws usually work out okay, as you said before. And you quoted in the book John Lovett. He said, quote, "A vision of human flourishing bounded by little else other than common sense and a concern for the well-being of others. It is the original inheritance of the whole species," in reference to the commons, to the land. It sounds very simple and very nice. And I just wanted to add that I love what you said about it really just rebuilding human trust. And I think that's what it comes down to. We have so many walls and fences in America, even schoolyards and churches and things like that. And I grew up in the Midwest in Ohio. And I remember being able to play on the schoolyard playgrounds or fields on the weekends. And that's almost not allowed anymore in a lot of places.
Roaming is it's a stolen inheritance from us. The passenger pigeons, which former Americans got to watch blacken the skies, or the bison who once roamed over the center parts of the country, the starry skies we used to get to see at night. These are all stolen inheritances. They're gone, and because a lot of us haven't witnessed the stealing of them within our lives, we don't even know they're gone. We don't even know they were there. So it takes an act of remembering to bring these things back, to give them a chance to come back. We need to remember the starry skies we can't see, or the animals we never got to encounter, or the roaming. And it takes an act of remembering, but imagination.
Yeah.
Or it takes an act of buying a plane ticket to Scotland and seeing the amazing freedoms they have, and how it's not weird or controversial or terrible, but an essential human right that all civilization should aspire to achieve.
I just want to say before I ask you my last question is that one of my dreams has been to traverse the Brooks Range, and I hope that it remains as wild as it can be. One of the worst things is to dream of a wild place and finally be able to visit and find that it's lost its wild character. That's what I most fear. But yeah, I admire that you were able to spend time in the Brooks Range. It's very cool.
It's my favorite place on earth. For a suburbanite from Buffalo, New York, to go out and get on top of a 5,000-foot mountain and look to the right and see nothing but what seems like 1,000 miles of wilderness, and the same to the left, just nothing but habitat for grizzlies and Dall sheep and moose and caribou. It's amazing, and I don't think you'll be disappointed. If you go in the summer, you might be a little bit disturbed with how much small aircraft is going above, just lots of hikers kind of going out into the park. But otherwise, you're likely to see nobody, and certainly no fire pit for you to clean up.
Well, that sounds amazing. So my last question is, if you could share a story about a special experience or connection that you have made in nature or with an animal.
I remember I was on patrol as a backcountry ranger in the gates of the Arctic Park, and it was sheep season. So my supervisor wanted me to get right on the border of the park and make sure no one came in to poach any Dall sheep, which are wild mountain sheep. And that was my job. I got to get paid for it. So I was sitting on this hill, and unbeknownst to me, this herd of caribou started migrating right in my path. And it wasn't one of those thick swarms. It was more a collection of 2 caribou, 5 caribou, 8 caribou, just little families of caribou. And this one little one must have been a year old, with eyes as big and black as 8 balls. It walked right up to me and stopped about 7 yards away and just stared at me. It was probably the first time it had ever seen a human. That was one of my most wonderful experiences in nature.
Well, thank you so much, Ken. Thank you so much for talking to me, and I really appreciate this book.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you so much for taking interest.
This is Wild Roots. Thanks for listening.